Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We are exploring Unit 3, The World at War, Section 2, Part B, World War II. Our self-test questions are big questions here that you see most frequently, couched through multiple choice, CRQs, etc. Describe and give examples of how appeasement, a specific policy leading up to World War II, may have led to World War II, or at least not prevented it. How did new weapons and technology affect the course and the outcome of World War II? What were the main turning points of World War II that helped to determine the conflict's outcome? And what war crimes and violations of human rights occurred during World War II? Pick two and describe them in detail. So first we have to look at this prelude to war. What is setting the stage for another multi-nation, world-spanning conflict after the world really just emerged from one, the so-called Great War of World War I. They didn't call it World War I back then. It was just the Great War. No one could ever think there'd be another one. Well, some of these we've already talked about in detail. After World War I, there were a lot of economic problems in a lot of different nations, and that led to political instability, as well as just political instability in and of itself in some of these nations. And that had seen the rise of fascist nations in Western Europe. Adolf Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini, Franco in Spain. The League of Nations, a international peacekeeping organization set up after World War I, was either unwilling or unable to stop the aggressiveness of fascist and totalitarian nations. Why were they unwilling or unable? A big one, they did not have an army. They could not actually enforce decisions. They could say, okay, well, you can't do that, but unless you're willing to back it up with force or at least a show of force, nothing's going to happen. So they're weak. They also lacked support from some of the stronger nations, and the United States chose to follow an isolationist policy, whereas maybe if we had done a more focused policy or been more interventionist in the world, perhaps maybe some nations would have been less likely to be aggressive. To avert war, leaders of Western democracies, specifically in Europe, turned to a policy of appeasement. Now, this has been on many different regions, it's both old and new, so this has a high likelihood of showing up. Appeasement is the act of pacifying or working to placate or pleasing someone by giving in to their demands. So basically, this is let's avoid war by avoiding confrontation. And you have a great cartoon here. You got Western leader Neville Chamberlain. We'll talk about shortly. He's got a fistful of lollipops, and he's handing out lollipops to all these Nazi swastika monsters. Okay, one more lollipop, and then you all have to go home. The idea is, well, if you just give him what he wants, he'll probably be quiet. He'll probably simmer down. So now we're going to walk through different examples of appeasement, how this policy worked out and didn't work out, so and so. So as we see the rise of fascist nations, one of the things these fascist leaders promise is, well, everything to their people, revitalize the economy, build up the military, make their countries great, etc., etc. And the first of their fascist leaders was Benito Mussolini, right? The founder of the quote-unquote fascist party in Italy. And he had these dreams of creating a true Italian empire, right? Like he wanted to bring back the greatness and glory of the Roman Empire. That's kind of the language that they used. And he wants colonies, right? For the same reason every other country does, for exploitable labor, for cheap natural resources, for the grandeur of the nation. And Italy had tried to invade Ethiopia before and had been soundly defeated by Emperor Menelik II. You might remember as one of our few examples of a successful leader who is able to continuously resist European overtures. Well, Mussolini invades in 1935, and now he has built up the Italian army. They have dive bombers, they have tanks, and they use poison gas, weapons that the Ethiopians just did not have because they didn't participate in World War I. So these were totally new and terrifying weapons. And they win. And the League of Nations protested. They're like, hey, Mussolini, That wasn't really cool of you, but they didn't do anything. I mean, at the very least, Great Britain, which had control over the Suez Canal, could have shut that canal, and that would have severely hampered the ability of the Italian military to resupply their soldiers with bullets, ammunition, gasoline, fuel, and food. And they would have had to go all the way around Africa. It could have possibly given the Ethiopians enough time to mount a structured defense or something. And they didn't even want to push a conversation. Whoa, whoa, whoa! If we shut the Suez Canal, it looks like we're taking sides, and that could be misinterpreted. And yeah, it could get real sticky real fast. Um, so they just did nothing. And the ruler of Ethiopia, King Haile Selassie, he traveled before the League of Nations and begged for their help. Please, you are Great Britain, France, you're these powerful nations. What are you going to do for us? And they're like, yeah, it's nothing we can do for you. Sorry, buddy. And he famously said, God and history will remember your judgment. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. And he proved a prophet. He proved correct. It would be then France, Great Britain on the hammered end of the Nazi war machine and of the fascist nations. Both Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and Benito Mussolini's Italy contributed arms and soldiers to the civil war going on in fascist Spain as Franco tried to consolidate fascist control there. And again, giving war material to a civil war is not really super generally like legal-ish, but again, nothing really happened. The League of Nations like, well, you shouldn't do that. Nothing happened. In 1931, the Empire of Japan, seeking greater hegemony, greater control, a larger sphere of influence in northern China, invaded Manchuria. They basically staged an attack on their own railroad line, what we call today a false flag operation. So they basically blew up parts of their own railroad that they were building and blamed it on Chinese nationalists and Chinese kind of revolutionaries. And they're like, okay, well, we need to invade Manchuria to secure our railroad lines and secure the property of the Empire of Japan. The real reason they were there is coal and iron, 100%. Manchuria has phenomenal resources of both coal and iron. These are key resources you need to continue industrialization, which Japan, the Empire of Japan, sorely wants to do and build up their military power. The League of Nations, again, protests. They call the Japanese emissary in front of them and like, well, this is really super not chill of you, bro. We'd really prefer you not to invade this other country with your entire army and navy. And Japan's like, yeah, all right, I'm just gone. Like, such a bummer. I'm out. Peace. And Japan just leaves the League of Nations. So it's really proving that it's a dog with no teeth for all intents and purposes. In 1937, Japan, realizing there's no consequences to their actions, invaded China proper and just began to invade China with the goal of, well, taking over at least coastal China, if not all of China. And you can see here, these are all the lands that Japan at one point or another eventually conquers during this World War II. So for China, World War II started long before it did for the rest of the world. Several years they were fighting World War II, or as they called it, the Pacific War. Again, League of Nations did nothing. The United States, as our own country, because we weren't in the League of Nations, we refused to join it, we placed sanctions. This is a key word. I'd love you to star it. We're going to be hitting it up again and again. Sanctions are some sort of restriction, economic restriction, meant economically to steer a country to do what you want to do. And we place these sanctions and restrictions on trade goods, specifically oil. Back in the day, we used to produce a ton of oil. We still produce a ton of oil. And Japan bought a lot of American oil and metals that could be used for military equipment. And we just said, yeah, we're not giving you loans anymore. We're not shipping you oil anymore. We're not shipping you military grade metals anymore. This is one of the things that will factor in Japan's decision to attack the United States is that we basically cut them off from one of their largest supplies of oil. And they're like, we got to find oil somewhere. This is getting scary. We're real low. Tank's real low. So keep that in mind. Resources are still driving the military, political, economic decisions of Japan, right? That impact of geography, that geographic context. And then there's appeasement and Adolf Hitler, which is like a whole different thing. You might remember that one of the key elements of the Nazi rise to power was Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party promising the German people that they would do away with the Treaty of Versailles, right? The Treaty of Versailles was what caused all of the problems of the German people. It was embarrassing to the German people, blamed them for the war, these crippling reparations. And so Adolf Hitler is going to fulfill this campaign promise. He's going to piece by piece tear up the Versailles Treaty, and that makes him seem like a hero to the majority of the people of Germany. So in 1935, shortly after taking power, he announces to the world that Germany will be defying the arms limitations elements of the Treaty of Versailles. What that means in simple speech is the Treaty of Versailles said Germany can't have an army or navy, can't have an air force, can't have a tank force, and can only have a small army. He's like, yeah, no, we're gonna go against all of that. We're gonna build a massive German army. We're gonna build a powerful German navy. We're going to build one of the best air forces the world has ever seen, and we're going to build tanks on tanks on tanks, bro. And he starts building up the military. Now, what this does is create jobs, millions and millions of jobs. You got to remember, this is the time period the Great Depression is hammering the entire world. When he comes to power, unemployment in Germany is like 33, 34%. 1 in 3 people cannot find any sort of job, not their dream job, not a well-paying job. They can't find any job. And all of a sudden, you throw your military into overdrive. All the soldiers are getting paychecks, and that's millions of people just straight up in the military getting a paycheck. And you also are building all this stuff. That's putting welders to work. That's putting factory workers to work. That's putting all sorts of people to work. 2, his next step. So what Hitler does is he makes one of his changes and he waits a couple months. He's like, all right, are we going to do anything about this? This is the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty that ends World War I. Technically, like if you create a peace treaty and one side violates the peace treaty, you go back to war. And that's what Hitler's waiting to see is anyone going to challenge me on this stuff? Is anyone going to do anything about it? And no one did. They just said, well, you really shouldn't do that, Hitler. In 1936, Hitler makes his next move. In the Treaty of Versailles, there was this area known as the Rhineland. It was the border between France and Germany. And according to the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed to put any military soldiers, fortresses, or material in the Rhineland. The idea here was if another war broke out, you'd have this massive stretch of German land that was undefended. France could easily push through it, and the war would be over. Instead of fighting in France like they had in World War I, they'd be fighting the war in Germany. In 1936, Adolf Hitler orders the reoccupation of the Rhineland. He basically says, yep, we're moving our army in here. We are building fortresses. We got tanks. We got soldiers here. This is Germany. We're going to treat it like German territory. Again, he waits. No one does anything. Nothing happens. In 1938, Hitler and the Nazis, appealing to this idea that all German-speaking people with a shared history and culture of being German should be united into one nation, right? Nationalism. You got to remember the Nazis are the Nationalist Socialist Party. And he announces the annexation of Austria. So Austria, again, was a different country. They do speak German. They do have a lot of shared elements of German history. And they speak, like I said, a form of German. And he's like, yeah, well, those are German people, so they belong in Germany. And literally, he just marches troops in. There's not really any fighting. Just marches troops in, and he's like, yeah, yep, I'm a dream maker. I'm uniting the German people. And this is known as Anschluss, or the unification. Here you got this great pro-Nazi cartoon, all right, that you have The German people, or the Austrian people here, German people here, seeking unification. Anschluss, this annexation of Austria, is the keystone in the bridge that will unite the German people. Again, no one does anything about this. So, politicians are like, well, this Hitler guy's crazy. And then other people were really appreciating him. I mean, his economic reforms bring the employment rate in Germany down to like 97, 98% employment. Like everyone was working in Germany. And this is why, Adolf Hitler gets named Time Magazine's Man of the Year 2 years, because of his revitalization of the German economy and the German ethos, as it were. So then things start to get a little sticky. And we're going to come to the Munich conference, and I'm going to want you to star that. That is pretty darn important. You see it very frequently on the regions, both old and new. So in 1938, with just success after success after success, Hitler's like, all right, I'm gonna see how far I can push this. What else can I get out of this? So he says, well, this new country, Czechoslovakia, that got created out of World War One, taking territory from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, taking some territory from Germany. Well, there's a lot of German-speaking people in some of the lands in there, specifically land called the Sudetenland. All right, and you can see that the Sudetenland is kind of these purplish areas here on this map. He goes, again, I'm uniting all German-speaking people into one Germany. And so I believe the German-speaking people of Czechoslovakia in this Sudetenland, they must be a part of the Third Reich. They must be a part of Nazi Germany. And, other countries like, whoa, Austria, they were like kind of Germans anyways. Like we, whatever. They're their own thing. They could have resisted. But like Czechoslovakia is a new country. We just created these guys. You can't just be claiming and carving up parts of it. And Hitler's like, hey, I'm a reasonable guy. Why don't you pop down, hang out in Germany? I'll show you all the cool stuff I've been rocking out in Germany here, how I'm revitalizing the economy. We'll have a little chit chat. So this is known as the Munich Conference. And I think enduring issue-wise, you could see this put into cooperation. You could definitely see it into the building of empires. You could see it in a lot of different stuff. So Munich is in Germany. The main players here are Adolf Hitler and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Star that. They have political cartoons on him. He's got this mustache thing going on. A lot of times he had striped pants. He's in charge of Great Britain. He's the Prime Minister. And there were other leaders from other major European countries, but no Czechoslovakians were there. Their prime minister didn't make it. And so they talk, and Hitler is like very calm, and he's like, hey, here's the deal. Just trying to bring together all the German people, just trying to create this nation. Once I get my land, once the Germans are unified, like that's all. That's all I want. It's just strength and unity for the German people. And so at the Munich conference, they sign the Munich Agreement. And what it does is give Hitler the Sudetenland. They take land away from this new country, and it gets joined to Nazi Germany. And Neville Chamberlain famously, he comes back. Here he is landing by plane back in Great Britain, waving this Munich agreement. And you have this famous radio broadcast. A British prime minister has returned from Germany, bringing peace with honor. I believe it is a peace for our time. And this was the official press release from the prime minister's residence in Great Britain. He says, I have peace, right? And this is why this fits into this concept of appeasement. They keep giving in because that seemed to them preferable to starting another world war. They're like, eventually this Hitler guy seems reasonable. He'll eventually stop asking for more stuff. And that's just not true. All right, realizing that he got what he wanted. Just a couple months later, the Nazis annex, they march in and take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And again, the League of Nations, following this policy of appeasement, and with no military being unable to do anything, they do nothing. And I think that, this picture has always struck me as so terrifying and powerful. This is the Sudeten Czech girl, and she's just crying. And the Nazis, and you can't see the other side of this picture, but the Nazis are parading through the streets. The Wehrmacht, the German army, is parading as they annex it, as they invade it, but there's no real fighting going on. And they want everyone to do the Sieg Heil, the Nazi salute. But inside, her heart is breaking. Like, her country's independence is gone. Maybe there's horror stories of the Nazis already happening. Whatever the case is, she's dying inside, but still holding out this Sieg Heil, because to not do so would catch the attention of the Nazis. And you don't want the Gestapo or the SS knocking on your door. Terrifying. So we have these different views. We have, pro and anti-appeasement. Both of these cartoons have appeared on the older style Regents, but still have appeared on Regents before. So you have this pro cartoon, pro appeasement, right? It looks at it as a positive thing. Neville Chamberlain, like I said, remember the mustache, gotta know this dude. Okay, he is wheeling the world to peace. That's how they saw it. That appeasement is the key to peace. He's wheeling it over the shaky, kind of broken, fragmented bridge of the Czech crisis, the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. He's wheeling the world away from the chaos of anarchy over the mountains and spikes of war. So that's your pro. That's your idea that the point of view here is that appeasement works. Appeasement is the only way to ensure world peace. And then you have this other one. You got Adolf Hitler, and is doing some sort of weird trombone thing. This is basically a very insulting gesture used during this time period. Very insulting. We don't use it anymore because it's weird. But it's really not super cool. And you have the spineless leaders of democracy, and it's really hard to read here. But these are different elements of this appeasement: Sudetenland, Anschluss, annexation of Austria, and he's walking towards being king of the universe. And this is saying this doesn't work. That all these people not standing up to these spineless leaders, that's just going to allow Hitler to goose step, that special Nazi walk, to becoming, leader of the entire world. So Hitler's made some powerful moves, and he is now joined millions more people, Austrians and Czechs, to this Nazi war machine. He has access to new resources. And then you have the problem of Russia, right? One of the things that had made Germany have difficulty finding success in World War I is the need to fight this two-front war. That if a war breaks out, they had to fight both Russia and they had to fight, France and Great Britain and all the other powers on the Western Front. So what if Hitler could make sure that he doesn't have to fight Russia? So he sends some of his agents to meet some of Stalin's agents. And what they sign is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. And this is signed in 1939. It's more commonly known as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Star that. So what this does is say there for 10 years, there's going to be no attacks between the USSR and Stalin and the Nazis and Hitler. 10 years of peace and amity on the part of these two nations. It also had a secret clause that said, without a doubt, Poland, another new country created after World War I, is going to be invaded by both the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And they are going to divide Poland between them. And the Soviets will get to invade Finland and take that over as well. And so again, the rest of the world doesn't know about that. They just know that this is a non-aggression pact between them. You had, great political cartoons from the time period. You have Hitler and Stalin appearing as a newly married husband and wife. Wonder how long the honeymoon will last. Because this seemed very strange to people. You have to remember, one of the things that the Nazis promised, one of the things that they kind of ran on as a political party, and Adolf Hitler himself was like, I'm anti-communist. I'm going to root out the communists. I'm going to kill the communists. Communists are bad. Communists is evil. Bolshevism is evil. The Bolsheviks are bad. Evil, evil, evil. And so then all of a sudden to kind of pull a 180 and be like, well, you know what? Communists are bad, but like they're going to do their own thing in their country. And we'll just focus on Nazi Germany and Nazi Germany living forever and being awesome. So they've got this border set. Now Hitler feels pretty confident he doesn't have to worry about fighting a two-front war. And so he's going to use the same tricks he's been using. He's going to begin to demand territory, specifically in Poland. He says, you know what, the city of Danzig, this is a very old German city, and its population is mostly German and German speaking. And so we need Danzig, and we need a strip of land connecting Danzig to Germany. Otherwise, I mean, if it's just the city, well, that's not very effective. And you have this political cartoon poster, a propaganda poster meant to kind of rally the Germans to his idea. Danzig ist Deutsch. Danzig is German, you know? And so he's like, yep, I want this. And he's kind of hoping to pull another Munich conference out of this. He's hoping that Neville Chamberlain or France or someone or all of the countries will just like be like, all right, here's the deal. We're going to give you Danzig, but nothing else. All right. Like, seriously, Hitler, you keep pulling this on us and we're not fooling for it again. But the Western powers refuse to give up any part of Poland, and they pledge a military alliance with Poland. Now, here's where you see things kind of from Hitler's point of view. He's like, yeah, you guys have always refused me stuff, and I still got what I wanted without really a shot being fired. I don't believe you. I'm gonna go ahead and take Poland. See what happens. And so this then leads to the spark or the shots that initiate World War II in Europe. And so, in September 1st, 1939, Hitler and the Wehrmacht, or the German military, the Nazi military, invades Poland. This is the beginning of World War II, and it initiates what's known as the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war used by the Nazis. And these are military tactics. They've been kind of debated by historians, like how real was the Blitzkrieg, but you know, my belief tends to be it was pretty real. Like, it's relatively real. All right, and so what it is the combined use of, well, combined arms, using bombing planes like the Junker and others, as well as armor, tanks, to spearhead an assault, followed up by infantry moving quickly behind. And in fact, some of the first uses of mechanized infantry, or infantry using mechanized vehicles, i.e., like troop carriers and stuff like that. And by invading through the Great Northern Plain, impact of geography, they have a stunning success. Poland is taken over, is defeated in 3 weeks. According to the secret elements of the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact, Stalin sent 1 million of his soldiers to invade and occupy eastern Poland as part of that deal. And then the Soviets also invade Finland, and that was known as the Winter War, and that was super brutal. 5% of all males, like across the age spectrum in Finland, died. The actual numbers of people in Finland that died are lower compared to like all of the other countries in World War II. But when you look at them as a sheer percentage of their population, they lost, like, every family lost someone or multiple people in this war between Finland and the Soviet Union. It was really, really brutal. But actually, the Finns are capable of, they keep their freedom. It's actually amazing, literally. So this is the war. It is now started. The Blitzkrieg is only possible because of new technologies like airplanes, like tanks, like mechanized infantry, and things like that. So again, here's a map showing this, what would be the historical circumstances of this, because it doesn't actually say World War II starting. That would be like a good thing, or talking about Germany kind of building up. And so, bam, they just sweep into Poland and take it over, while the Soviet Union sweeps into Poland and takes off parts of it, as well as Lithuania and some other countries like that. So now what you're going to have is, just like in World War I, different alliances form, different sides form. And so the two alliances that end up fighting this war out in, a bar brawl are the Axis powers, which is Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, the Empire of Japan, and their client states like Bulgaria and Romania, and the Allied powers, Great Britain and their colonies. France is really their main country at first, and then later the USSR. We'll talk about why they enter the war, and the United States. So this is the map at the end of the war of really what's going on. The red nations are Axis nations. The orange are the areas they conquered at the height of their power. So Japan conquering this huge swath and carving out right their greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and the Nazis taking over most of Western Europe, large portions of Western Europe, and most of Eastern Europe too, at the height of their power. I mean, if the war had ended, Hitler got what he wanted, which is his Lebensraum, his growing room. And you have your neutral nations. You have Vichy France and Vichy territory. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you have the Allied nations. So you can see writing's on the wall. Like it's most of the world versus these little segments here. So Poland's conquered, and now Germany, Nazi Germany, is going to turn its attention to its great historical enemy, France, right? They don't have to worry about the Soviet Union. They don't have to worry about a two-front war because they've already conquered Poland. They can turn the full fury and might of the Wehrmacht against the French. Now, in between World War I and World War II, the French had been like, well, we don't want to get invaded again, so we got to make sure we got top-notch defenses here. And they had poured millions and millions and millions of dollars into constructing what was known as the Maginot Line, named after its architect. And this was a series of underground, built into hills and mountains with poured concrete, reinforced with steel rebarb fortresses, just huge underground fortresses. They had tram systems, underground highways that allowed the fortresses to resupply each other, to move troops, ammunition, and food. There were even some bunks that were air conditioned because it got hot under there. They had heavy cannons, machine guns. It was an incredible series of fortresses that would make any invasion from Germany into France very, very costly. It would be very tough to do. So the Germans just did what they did in World War I. They're like, hey, guys, do you guys remember when we just invaded through Belgium and it was a lot easier? And they're like, yeah, that worked pretty well. You want to just do that again? Yeah, I do. That sounds great. And so they invaded through Belgium, conquering another country, invading through that great northern plain. Again, that impact of geography, this flat area that allows tanks, that allows vehicles to move relatively quickly, relatively easily. They swept through, they trapped the French army into this Maginot Line. The cannons and all the weapons of the Maginot Line could only fire in a 180-degree arc into Germany. They couldn't turn around. So they're effectively useless. And they basically just conquered France. France fell in 35 days. It did not last long. And so all of a sudden, Nazi Germany is seriously, seriously powerful. So the Nazis occupied northern France, Paris, essentially, right there's Hitler walking in the Eiffel Tower in the background. And then they signed a deal with some government leaders of France and southern France, and they created a client state, another one of these client states known as Vichy France, because its new capital, Paris was taken over by the Nazis, was given over to this old spa city known as Vichy. And they picked as their ruler this guy named Pétain, who had been a very famous World War I general for the French people. So these are allied to the Nazis. Pétain is well, I'm doing this to preserve French culture, so France doesn't cease to exist. But the reality is, they're doing what the Nazis want. When the Nazis start rounding up Jews, Pétain and Vichy government help them, sometimes a little too enthusiastically. Now, while this happened, there were still many French soldiers, many French soldiers who did not want to give up. But they were just surrounded and getting battered and driven forward by the Nazi tanks and the aircraft. And there also was the British Expeditionary Force that had landed to help them, just like they had in World War I. And what you saw was a very famous evacuation at Dunkirk, that the Nazis just start hammering and pushing the French army, what's left of it hasn't already surrendered, into this one little coastal city. And the British organized this massive evacuation where they basically order all boats, not all military boats, not even all cargo boats, If you got a rowboat, you need to come over from England, row it over, pick up as many soldiers as you can, and bring them back to England. And, it arguably is successful. It's one of the greatest, most successful evacuations in the world of a military force. They rescue almost 500,000 soldiers. And this allows the British to keep fighting because they didn't lose 500,000 of their men. It allows the French government in exile to be created under one of their generals named de Gaulle. And now Germany's kind of free to turn its efforts towards its last major enemy, Great Britain. Right now, France has been defeated. All right, Poland, we got that. Belgium, we conquered it. A bunch of other countries in the north of Europe, yep, conquered. I guess it's just Great Britain. So, what then begins in the summer and autumn of 1940 is known as the Battle for Britain. This is the first ever air campaign. Like the Nazis didn't land infantry, they really had different goals. They wanted to knock England out of the fight to have them sign a peace treaty. I mean, yeah, Hitler drew up plans for like actually invading England, but his general was like, yeah, that's not going to work. And even Hitler back then wasn't too crazy yet. So he was like, yeah, that doesn't seem like a great idea. He just wanted to force Great Britain as a democracy. He's like, I'll make lives so painful for their civilians that they'll demand a peace treaty. Like, they've got no soldiers in Europe. I've driven them all out. They evacuated them. Just sign a peace treaty. Let the Nazis run Western Europe. Let them control all of Europe except for Italy and Spain because they're allied fascist nations. And that's it. And so this is an air campaign. The Luftwaffe, which is the Nazi Air Force, began to bomb military and civilian targets, including cities. So this idea of total war that, we're not just bombing tanks, we're not just bombing military bases. We're going to try and knock the gusto, the will to fight out of your very people itself. And if this, had been completely successful, the overall goal would have been to give air superiority and then possibly maybe even invade England if necessary. And this is one of these great examples that, Hitler might have been maybe a good political leader in terms of, strengthening Germany, etc. Obviously, his flaws and evil as well. But he was not a great military leader. And the Germans had a lot of very good military leaders. Their high command and their field staff were literally excellent. Like, for all of them losing World War I, they were very excellent strategists and tacticians. But the generals generally would let themselves get overruled by Hitler. Like, they'd be like, hey, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this. But if Hitler kept pressing them to do something different, they wouldn't stand up to him. They were too afraid. So in the beginning, the Luftwaffe is bombing military targets. They're blowing up oil refineries and oil and gasoline storage locations. They're bombing British airfields. They're bombing British planes, like, on the ground. And it's like working. They're really hammering the British Royal Air Force, their Air Force. And then Hitler's like, well, this isn't working fast enough. And, no one cares about a military base, stuck somewhere in Scotland. We need to bring this war personal. I want you to turn your attention to the city. Start bombing London. Start bombing major cities. And his general's like, yeah, but you know what? Like, if we do that, it'll give the British time to evacuate their planes. It'll give them time to set up new air bases. Right now we almost got them on the ropes in a boxing match. Like, let us keep doing this. And Hitler's like, nope, bomb London, bomb cities. And they're like, all right, that's what we'll start doing. And it actually does give the British Air Force a breather for a couple weeks and a couple months, and allows them to move their air forts, move their planes, and resupply. So the Battle for Britain then, the British pilots, the Royal Air Force, they sustained brutally heavy losses. But eventually, mostly because Hitler turned his attention to the cities, they win the Battle for Britain. Now, Nazis continued occasionally bombing parts of London, parts of other major cities. This is known as the Blitz. And the British built, underground bomb networks where people could go and hide. People just hid in the subways. But not winning This is really the Nazis' first major defeat. They wanted to knock Great Britain out of the war, and they didn't. And so this is really the first time that Hitler didn't get exactly what he wanted. And a lot of historians give credit to Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England, as instrumental in keeping up the morale of the British people. Once appeasement didn't work, Neville Chamberlain gets voted out of power, and they bring Winston Churchill in. And Churchill's a very interesting guy. Lots of demons in his closet, but also literally carried on his back the British Empire through World War II. And he hated the Nazis. He hated them. And he would do whatever he could to get victory. If you're going through hell, keep going. Huge, huge monuments to the Royal Air Force who sacrificed so much. Never was so much owed by so many to so few individuals. And he would go on the radio and give these amazing speeches, convincing the British people, convincing fellow politicians, like, we have to keep fighting. And so we've got a couple versions of it because they've used parts of these several times. So this is his speech shortly after the evacuation of Dunkirk. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo, Nazi secret police, and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to rescue and the liberation of the old. So there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, geographic context. One of the things that's saving Great Britain, that didn't save France, is they're an island nation. So it's always going to be harder to invade an island nation. And he's acknowledging that with a strong fleet and a strong air force, we can basically protect ourselves. And then he's saying, our empire will keep us fed. Our empire will keep us going. And then hopefully the new world, i.e. America, will someday step in. And again, we weren't yet. We were doing our isolationist thing. And then, again, parts of this speech. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. In this, this revitalized British morale. This made your average British person be like, we got to stick it to the Nazis. We can't just throw in the towel. Because there were powerful politicians in Great Britain who said, you know what? France is lost. Like, why are we going to fight France's war? This is silly. Let's just sign a peace treaty. Hitler gets Europe. We get, the British fleet. We get our empire. We still have India. We still have all of our colonies. What do we really care about Belgium or Poland or Czechoslovakia or even France? Like, France had their shot. They didn't make it. Like, let's just sign a peace treaty with Hitler. But these speeches, they drum up enough support that Churchill gets the British to continue fighting. So the war proceeds apace with the Blitz going on. And then what happens is Hitler makes, he makes another decision, and it's not going to be a great one for him. He had been secretly planning an invasion of the Soviet Union as part of Hitler's vision for Lebensraum, for growing room. He wanted Eastern Europe. He wanted the breadbasket of the Ukraine. He wanted the oil of the Ural Mountains and the minerals of the Ural Mountains. And so even though he has this 10-year Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact, he has his generals start planning Operation Barbarossa. And the goal was to invade the Soviet Union, destroy their government. Why? Well, he realizes that they're going to need oil. So the Caucasus would provide oil so he could continue the war against Great Britain. The wheat fields from the Ukraine would provide enough food for the Nazi war machine. And the iron and metals in the Ural Mountains would keep his military going, would allow him maybe to build up military strength enough to finally, once and for all, knock Great Britain out of the war. And, this is such a wild military plan, just so many men mobilized for this. And the crazy thing is, like, Stalin didn't believe it. Stalin's generals, which there weren't many of them because he again had killed most of them in the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, those generals that are left are telling Stalin, hey, like the Nazis are focusing a lot of soldiers on our border. Like they're really building up a lot of soldiers on our border in Poland. Like, do you want us to mobilize our army? Do you want us to call in conscripts? Do you want us to prepare for the Nazis to invade us? And Stalin's like, no, like, I trust Hitler. I've met this guy. We're good. Like, we're all set. We're going to be fine. He tells me this is just them doing training exercises. They're consolidating their control over Poland. I believe him. And then, bam, Hitler launches this. Now, another example of Hitler making a decision that his generals opposed is his generals basically asked for some more time. Like, we got this operation plan. It's going to be a good plan. We think we got this, but we need more time. We can't launch it during the Rasputitya. That's basically like the spring and fall of the Soviet Union, of Russia. And it's this time period where you obviously have winter in the middle, which is brutal, right? That's what stopped Napoleon. And then you also have the Rasputitya, which is mud. It's the spring and it's the fall and it's mud, 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 mud. Like even tanks can't move through this stuff. It literally grinds economic activity in Russia to a standstill for all intents and purposes, except for railroads. And Hitler's like, nope, launch it when I say so. I want it. We got to have it right now. That's what we got to do. Now, initially, it does have some successes. I mean, they pushed 500 miles into Russia. They came within shelling range of Moscow, the capital, but the Nazi war machine was stopped. And the invasion of the Soviet Union, this Eastern Front War, is some of the bloodiest and most brutal battles and sieges of the entire European war. And it's not to discount the losses in France and Belgium and other countries, but these were bloody beyond bloody. Leningrad, which you might remember was what they renamed St. Petersburg, that gets besieged by the Nazis. The goal here is, this is a major city that controls huge elements of the Soviet fleet, the Baltic fleet. We need to take this. And there are 3.5 million Soviet casualties. Germany loses 500,000 men, and they lose. And it's brutal. Some historians have labeled the siege of Leningrad a genocide because literally, like in Nazi paperwork, in Nazi orders, we can see them being like, yeah, we're not even going to take this city and like take it over. We're going to plow the city over and we're going to enslave or kill the entire civilian population, not just the soldiers. Of course, they're going to die. We're going to enslave and or murder the entire population of this multi-million person city. But they failed. The Soviets are able to keep the city supplied-ish. Millions did die of starvation. And they evacuate as many as they can, and they're able to eventually relieve this siege. And the same thing with Stalingrad. Stalingrad, obviously named after Stalin himself. This was a major industrial center where weapons and tanks were produced. And Hitler believes that if he can take Stalingrad, this is going to be a shocking morale blow to the entire Soviet Union. And he's hoping it will literally break Stalin himself. But it doesn't. again, the Soviet Union just pours soldiers. They literally say there's no turning back. You either die from Nazi guns or you die from ours. The commissars had license to kill anyone who retreated, and it works. I mean, the cost is brutal. 2.25 million men die fighting, but it's a major turning point. The Nazis never get any further than Leningrad and Stalingrad. Now, to the Russians, this is actually not generally called World War II. It's called the Great Patriotic War. And so, what you see in Russia as the Nazis make their gains is the Soviets using the same tactics as the Russians under Tsar Alexander had against Napoleon. Retreat when you can, scorched earth, burn crops, burn materials, destroy everything that could be used by the Nazis, and then just let winter and the massive supply chains in the cold climate, let those just slow the Nazi war machine down. And so while they make these initial gains 500 miles into the Soviet Union because they invade initially in June, once the Rasputita, the wet season sets in the fall, and then once the winter sets in, bam, the Nazis are just halted. Now Hitler orders his troops, you cannot retreat. Like, this is it. This is a battle for the soul of Europe. It's us versus the horrible Untermensch, the under people of the Slavs, and the evils of communism. But his soldiers, isolated in this cold, the roads shut down, they run out of food, they run out of fuel, they run out of ammo. All the things that gave the Nazis military advantage, their powerful tanks, their more advanced planes initially, they can't even start in this cold. I mean, you gotta remember, they didn't have like electric car starters back then. This is some pretty early on machinery, and this stuff just won't even start. Even oil and gasoline are literally freezing. It's that cold in Russia. And eventually the armies of the Nazis are surrounded and forced to retreat. The long supply lanes can't be maintained, and just entire armies of Nazis start getting captured. 90,000 men here, 35,000 Nazi soldiers here. And so this really bleeds Nazi Germany dry. You got this great political cartoon, Old Man Winter clawing a Nazi plane out of the sky and stopping in its tracks a Nazi tank. And I mean, the Soviets pulled some wild maneuvers here, knowing that they cannot continue the war if the Nazis are able to successfully take over like ammunition production facilities or tank production factories. They literally just shipped in workers just from wherever, didn't matter, conscripted all these workers, and they disassembled entire factories. They took them apart, nut and bolt, threw them on trains, or in some cases, just like, here, everyone carries one heavy metal piece, and marched these Russian men across the Ural Mountains to the other side where it would be, they thought they'd be a lot safer, and they rebuilt these factories in the space of months. And then they started turning out thousands of rifles, thousands of machine guns, thousands of Soviet tanks. And then around this time, when the Nazi surge into the Soviet Union is starting to slow down because of the winter, the United States enters the war. Now, we claim to be neutral, we claim to be isolationist, but from the very get-go, the U.S. had been supplying arms and supplies to the Allies, selling them weapons, selling them food was a huge one, fuel. And then our President FDR, secretly signed a document known as the Atlantic Charter. He met with Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and they said, listen, we believe in free trade. We believe in self-determination, the right of countries to choose their own government. And, we want every group of people should have freedom. And that becomes the model for peace after this war. So we were already leaning towards entering the war on the side of the Allies. But there still was a lot of propaganda on both sides. A lot of people didn't want us to be involved in a quote-unquote European war. And you got this great Dr. Seuss cartoon. It's been used on both the U.S. history regions and the global regions. You have America, right? And you got the top hat of Uncle Sam. Ho hum, when he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll be quite likely be tired. And you have Norway and Greece and all these countries that the Nazis had taken out and controlled. And then he's chipping away at England, the last one. This idea of isolationism, that like, we're all set. We've got the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans protecting us. We can't really be touched. Impact of geography there. And then Japan attacks the naval base at Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, as FDR said in his address to Congress, a day that will live in infamy. We declare war on Japan, Nazi Germany declares war on us, we declare war back on Nazi Germany, and bam, we now join the Allied powers. Now, why did Japan attack us? Well, here's the deal. They've been fighting in China for several years at this point, right? They invaded Manchuria in 31. Now they've been fighting in Shanghai and other parts of China, and they still need oil, and we still won't sell them oil. So they need to expand and take over some Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Jakarta, other islands like that, because there is oil there. There is oil refineries there, and there's just like supplies of oil, as well as resources of oil. And they want to make sure that they have a couple years in order to consolidate their control over these islands and other territories that they deem to have crucial resources for the Empire of Japan. And so the Japanese High Command reasoned that if they could hit the American Navy hard enough at Pearl Harbor, if they could damage enough supplies, blow up enough oil refineries and storage systems, and destroy enough ships, that they could effectively destroy most of the Pacific Fleet, that sure, America would declare war, but it would take us years to rebuild the military capability of this Pacific Fleet. And that would be years that the Empire of Japan could use to consolidate their control over land, to reinforce, to fortify these islands. And they can make the war very costly. Or that maybe if they hit us hard enough, America would be like, yeah, you know what? Peace out. Like, let's just sign a peace. We're done. We don't care about the rest of the Pacific Ocean. And the attack on Pearl Harbor was wildly successful. They sank several of our major mainline warships, but they missed one of the most important parts. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, our aircraft carriers, a crucial new weapon of World War II, they were not in Pearl Harbor. They were out on maneuvers. They were, doing basically war drills and testing the ships out at sea. And the Japanese Navy missed them. So yeah, they hammered cruisers, they hammered destroyers, they blew up tons of airplanes, crippling our Pacific Air Force for a little while. They did hit some refineries, causing some massive damage there. But most famously, the Japanese High Command at Pearl Harbor, they launched two major waves, and they called off the third one, which would have hit the oil refineries, would focused a lot more on the oil and supply depots. And they called that attack off. And they're like, nope, we've done enough. Like, at this point, the Americans are responding. We're going to lose too many ships and too many fighter craft if we continue these bombing runs. So we're good. Mission accomplished. And a lot of historians have wondered if they'd launched that third wave, or if they'd caught the aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor, like, what would this war have turned into? But anyways, the Japanese attack on the naval base of Pearl Harbor, that is the spark that gets America finally to enter the war on the Allied side. And we basically cut a deal with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. You're like, we're going to focus on the Nazis. Like, we're going to fight the Japanese. We're definitely going to throw the Marines at them. We're going to start taking some islands. But we are going to do a double down on taking out the Nazis first, because we think they're the greatest threat for the time being in Europe, certainly. So the Allied and Axis powers are fighting across the world. There's submarine warfare and destroyers attacking each other in the Atlantic Ocean, just like we saw during World War I. The Soviets are trying to resist the Nazi war machine on the Great Northern Plain in Western Russia / Eastern Europe. And then you have fighting in North Africa. The North African campaign was about a couple major things. One, oil, and some oil. There are huge reserves of oil both in North Africa, Algiers, as well as in the Middle East. And if you control North Africa, that's your highway, that's your pathway to the Middle East. And control of the Suez Canal, right? The British have this This is a major strategic waterway. If the Nazis could claim control of the Suez Canal, they could choke Great Britain off from supplies from pretty much all of their colonies. And that would be a huge step because, yeah, you're an island nation, great, you're protected, but you also rely on importing goods and importing foodstuffs and importing all sorts of stuff to keep your little island nation going. Um, and also, obviously, control of North Africa would give you control over the southern Mediterranean, and the Nazis already had control over large portions of the northern Mediterranean. It would give them control of the Mediterranean. And they sent, the Nazis sent one of their best guys down there, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, one of the most brilliant military commanders of the entire war, and certainly that the Nazis had. But they're ultimately unsuccessful. That, with America leaning in, a couple key battles where the British just proved kind of badasses, they are able to protect the Suez Canal and slowly able to drive the Nazis back into a strategic retreat out of Africa. And Rommel is one of these interesting guys where he's not a big fan of Hitler. Like, he believes in Germany first. He believes Germany should be a world power, but he really doesn't like Hitler. And after he returns from Africa, he joins other generals, other high commanders who don't really love Hitler. They like, being powerful, and they are fine being Nazis if that's what it takes to be powerful. But they don't really like some of the crazy ideology of the Nazi Party. They definitely don't like Hitler. And so he joins this plot to assassinate Hitler. And, maybe I don't think he was going to take control over Germany, but they would basically have a different government. And this plot is found out. And, the Gestapo come to Rommel's house and they offer him this choice. They're like, here's the deal. We can arrest you and we can force a confession out of you, and that will be its own thing. And we're definitely going to kill you after that. But we don't want to do that because then other Germans who, think you're the best, who think you're a brilliant military commander, they're going to wonder why you plotted to kill Der Führer, the leader, Adolf Hitler. So we want you to commit suicide instead, and then we're going to give you a state funeral as a hero. We'll say you died to war wounds or whatever like that. And if you don't, yeah, we will arrest you and we'll have a trial and everything, but we're going to torture the crap out of your family. And so Rommel commits suicide. And he gets a big state funeral as a hero to the Nazi Party, and that this chink in the armor of the Nazi Party kind of isn't exposed. That people are really plotting against Hitler and the other high up Nazis elsewhere for attack in southern parts of southern France, and we're gonna just dump it off the side of a boat. And the Nazis are gonna find this and be like, "Whoa, we got the whole Allied battle plan. We got this," and they're gonna divert forces there. And this Normandy was under defended to what it should have been because the Nazis thought this attack was coming somewhere elsewhere. But even under defended, I mean, they're just walking into machine guns and artillery. It's terrifying. So, I mean, there's so much more fighting. There's so much more to unpack here, and I feel like I never get to do it full justice. But I got to hit the highlights. I got to hit the things that we've seen show up in multiple choices before. So Hitler and the Nazis are getting pushed back. They're losing ground. I mean, they're fighting hard. They're taking out a lot of Allied soldiers. Pound for pound, the Nazi soldiers were very, very fierce. And at this point, they're experienced. For all, our vigor, the American soldiers at first weren't experienced. They hadn't been fighting a war for years where the Nazis have. And the Nazis want this last-ditch attack. Hitler says, we're not out of this fight yet. We're going to smash the Allied supply lines. We're going to cut off their soldiers from supplies in the cold of winter. And this is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Last-ditch attack by Hitler. This is the last of the gasoline reserves, the last of everything they had. And they did catch the Allied powers by surprise. Like, most Allied commanders did not think that the Nazis still had this kind of military capability to launch another offensive in the West, but it was defeated. And this is the focus of a phenomenal miniseries called The Band of Brothers. Highly recommend if you get a chance to watch it, because the Nazis hit us where we were like our softest. And they used the cover of like a winter storm, so we couldn't use our air support, which was better. We had trouble with our tanks because of the cold weather, and so the brunt of this fell on like paratroopers and infantry. But our brilliant commanders, Patton being one of them, were able to blunt this attack, give us the time needed to have a counterattack, and now after the Battle of the Bulge, this last-ditch effort, Allied forces begin to push into Germany itself, with both the Soviet Russians and the United States racing really to try to be the ones to take the capital, Berlin, because thought whoever takes the capital kind of wins the war per se. So the war drags on, and it is very violent fighting. I mean, you remember those Hitler Youth, right? The Hitlerjugend. Those kids start being armed with like Panzerfaust or one-shot bazookas, and they're like, "All right, kid, hide in this sewer ditch, and when a tank goes over the ditch, fire the shot into the underside of the tank." Well, won't I die? Yes, you'll die, but you'll die for the Führer. You'll die for Adolf Hitler, who you've sworn an oath of loyalty to. And these brainwashed kids are like, "Yep, that sounds legit to me," and realizing how brutal the fighting is. Basically, the U.S. says, "Yeah, you know what? The Soviet Union can just go take Berlin. That is going to be some seriously brutal, awful urban fighting door to door, fighting the city. Urban fighting is always horrifically violent and horrifically terrifying because there's just so many hiding spots in it. It's hard to dig people out of buildings." And with the Soviet Union having taken Berlin, Hitler commits suicide May 5th. 2 days later, what's left of the German high command surrenders unconditionally. That means they're like, well, we surrender, but Germany still gets to be a thing. They surrender without conditions completely. We completely give ourselves over to you. Please be merciful. And so this becomes a central part of what's going to happen in the Pacific War is if the Allies demand unconditional surrender from Germany, they're going to also have to demand unconditional surrender from Japan too. So May 7th, 1945, this is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. This is a painting of a very famous photo of the Soviet soldiers waving the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. This is the parliament building of Germany. We do know like this photo was staged, as many photos were during this war to kind of increase morale. When this happens, Mussolini, Italy had already been invaded by Allied forces. He'd been captured and killed by his own people. They shot his body a bunch of times, beat it with baseball bats, and so he's done. El Duce's done. Hitler's gone. So now it's going to be the Pacific. This is the Pacific War. Now, in the ensuing years, Japan had eventually conquered most of China and most of Southeast Asia, building that what they wanted to be the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. They had pursued economic imperialism in the areas they conquered. They used and took raw materials from the areas: coal, iron, oil, rubber, and food. And a big one, violation of human rights, exploitation of labor. They used other Asians as cheap or slave labor. And that's certainly how the Empire of Japan was significant in impacting the lives of the people they conquered. Now, the Japanese, in their own propaganda, pitched themselves as liberators, that we're not conquerors, we're here to free Asia, freeing Asians from Western control, Asia for Asians. It just so happens that the Japanese, as the greatest of the industrializing Asians, as the ones who have one-on-one beaten European nations, we should be in charge of this Asia for Asians. We're the best Asians. We should be in charge. Other Asians, Koreans, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, they saw the Japanese as brutal and cruel conquerors, probably because they were brutal and cruel conquerors. Japan had hoped to knock the U.S. out of the war by destroying our Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor and fortifying all these islands, building massive fortresses into the hills and mountains, and basically making it too costly for America to try and beat back Japan. You have this great quote. This is by Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he was the one who planned Pearl Harbor and ordered Pearl Harbor. And this is a quote of his to the Japanese high command. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. So he's literally telling them, like, we've got 6 months, maybe a year, and we're going to win all these victories. And they did. I mean, they captured all of this territory. Myanmar from the British, all these islands from the Dutch, China. But he says after that, if we can't get America to agree to a peace treaty, to at least agree to an armistice, a cease and ending of the fighting, I'm telling you right now, we're never going to win. Yamato did not live to see his prophecy be correct. He was killed by a headhunting mission by the American Air Force and Navy. We knew he was traveling on a plane, and we souped up a bunch of fighters with heavy 50 caliber guns, and we hunted that plane through the Pacific and shot it out of the sky, effectively kind of assassinating him. So, what did the war in the Pacific look like? Well, we had this strategy called island hopping, and I would start, its impact of geography, historical circumstances. We realized that the Japanese had really fortified the hell out of a lot of these islands, and it would be a waste of resources, it would be a waste of manpower, it would be a waste of American lives if we took every single island. So we began to follow a strategy called island hopping. We would, when we could, ignore the most defended Japanese islands and hit the smaller islands and hit their supply lines. A lot of credit goes to like the American aircraft carriers and the American battleships. One of the unsung heroes of the Pacific War was the American submarine fleet, which was wildly more active in the Pacific. And our submarines were nasty at sniping Japanese supply ships. And, for all your military power in the world, if your soldiers can't get food and they can't get supplied with gasoline, fresh water if need be, with bullets, with whatever, grease for gears on artillery, your military machine grinds to a stop in this age of industrialized warfare. And that's what our submarines were really good at doing is sinking all these Japanese cargo ships and smaller warships, not big warships, smaller ones. And one of the big turning points of this war is the Battle of Midway. Basically, the Japanese were planning a trap for us, and we had cracked Japanese military codes. We knew they were planning a trap for us. And so we got a trap for them. We set a trap for them. And this was a major turning point. We sank several of their aircraft carriers, and arguably their fleet's never going to be as powerful again. Meanwhile, we start building destroyers, we start building aircraft carriers faster and faster. And the idea here is we'll eventually just starve out the Japanese soldiers, we'll starve out the Japanese Navy, and creep our way island by island to get within bombing and invasion range of Japan itself. So ignore the fortress islands when we can. I mean, some of them still had to be taken, literally, like that's the island we needed. But try and hit the smaller islands and set up air force bases on them, set up air runways on them. As the war begins to turn against the Japanese, island hopping proves a wildly successful strategy, and they became desperate to avoid an unconditional surrender because they saw that this would be abandoning the emperor, abandoning the Kokutai system of imperial Shintoism. They began more and more desperate attacks, and one of the most famous of these is the kamikaze attack. Kamikaze, as a translation in Japanese, means divine wind. It was the name originally given to the storms that had protected Japan from the Mongolian invasions, two different Mongolian invasions decades apart, and these massive storms, these divine god winds, had smashed the Mongolian invasions. And so now the Japanese high command tells these Japanese pilots, you are the new divine wind. You are the kamikaze. and they loaded their planes up with TNT and explosives, and they steered them at the decks of American ships. It's kind of successful. They did sink 37 to 47 ships. They damaged 350 others. And it was expected that these Japanese soldiers would be glad, right? They'd been brainwashed, just like the Hitler Youth. The state Shintoism had said, it is the most honorable thing, it is the greatest thing in the world to give your life for the emperor. He is walking God. You would be happy, you should be happy to give your life in the name of the emperor and for the protection of the kami of Japan itself. Infantry on the ground, soldiers on the ground were forced into what were called banzai attacks. Banzai is kind of an exclamation. Rough translation is like for greatness or for glory or for the emperor. It's got a lot of nuanced meaning there. And these were suicidal charges on U.S. forces. And basically like human wave attacks. Like, hey, we know the Americans have like machine guns and artillery and flamethrowers, but we're going to line up, 200 feet away. I'm going to wave my sword and we're going to banzai and we're going to charge into the American lines. And, you might laugh, but these were pretty terrifying and effective because the Japanese were very good at like sneaking real close to the American lines. And all of a sudden you got people with bayonets and swords hacking at you. Pretty terrifying stuff. And Japanese soldiers were expected to spend themselves in these suicidal attacks or commit suicide rather than surrender. Surrendering was the greatest dishonor. It brought the greatest shame to your family. Better to die on your own sword, better to die by holding a grenade to your stomach and blowing yourself up than giving yourself in surrender and dishonoring your family and your ancestors. So the Japanese proved a brutal opponent because of this brainwashing and because of this idea. But it's always interesting the difference between reality and kind of what's pitched to you and what people really feel. And I've got this great quote. These suicide pilots, these kamikaze pilots, write letters home, and like Nazis, like even the American military, we would read letters from soldiers to make sure they weren't sending home depressing stuff. We got to keep up morale. And so most of these letters never made it home to the families in Japan. And then basically huge treasure troves of these letters were found in the 90s and finally delivered if they were living family members. But these showed kind of the true feelings of some of these people. And this is just one. There's hundreds and hundreds of these from Ichizo Hayashi, and it's his last letter home. And he's writing to his parents. I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a member of a special attack force. So he's a kamikaze pilot that is on its way to battle. But I cannot help crying when I think of you, Mom. When I reflect on the hopes you had for my future, I feel so sad that I'm going to die without doing anything to bring you joy. Even for a short life, there are many memories. For someone who had a good life, it is very difficult to part with it. But I reached a point of no return. I must plunge into an enemy vessel. To be honest, I cannot say that the wish to die for the Emperor is genuine or real, coming from my heart. However, it is decided for me that I die for the Emperor. Because this was their government willing to waste them on these attacks. As more and more islands are taken, the Allies and the United States, because we're part of the Allied powers, meet in a conference known as the Potsdam Conference. And I'd like you to star that. It does show up on Regencies sometimes. And this is towards the end of the war, right? The end of the war is clearly in sight. And we need to come up with the terms for Japan's surrender. So this is America, Great Britain, Russia, and Chiang Kai-shek from China. And we send Japan a warning. And this is the declaration of Potsdam Conference. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Japan gave no official answer. They didn't want to do an unconditional surrender. They were hoping if they could drag the war out, if they could kill more Americans, if they could make the war costly, that they would get better surrender terms. They'd get to keep some of their military. They'd get to keep the emperor. They'd get to keep this different stuff. And so the US began to consider and plan for the necessity of an actual invasion of Japan. And our first taste of what invading civilian population centers of Japan might look like, came with the invasion of the island of Okinawa. Now, Okinawa had been considered by the Japanese to be their territory for a long time. Yes, they took it as they were a rising empire, but they'd had it for a really, really long time. It had been colonized by the Japanese. It also had local Okinawan people. Um, and so this was their home turf. This is the first, it's not one of the mainland Japanese islands, but to the Japanese, this is Japan. And even today, even after that war, like Okinawa is still part of Japan. It is part of the nation of Japan now. And this fighting for one of these quote unquote like home islands proves horrifying. It cost the Americans 85,000 US casualties, 95,000 Japanese soldiers dead, and between 100 and 150,000 civilian Okinawan deaths. And you can use these numbers to like, okay, if this is the population of how many Japanese soldiers are defending this island, and if this is how many people live there, and then this is how many soldiers died, and this is how many civilians died, and this is how many American lives it took, you can start to do the math to kind of figure out what's it going to take to actually take Japan, like to take, Kyoto, to take the islands, take Tokyo. And so the best estimates, i.e., like the most conservative ones, said that an invasion of Japan proper would cost between 1.7 and 4 million Americans wounded, severely wounded, or dead, including about 800,000 fatalities. So almost a million American dead, just dead, and 5 to 10 million Japanese fatalities. And it wouldn't just be soldiers, it was going to be civilians too. We saw in Okinawa that the Japanese soldiers basically said, the Americans are animals. They're going to rape, kill, pillage. They're going to eat your children in front of you. You can't live. And so Okinawans, believing this propaganda, they like killed themselves in huge numbers, throwing themselves. There's these famous cliffs, the suicide cliffs. There's bones down there. Entire villages would kill themselves. And even the Japanese military would kill their own civilians rather than let them surrender. So really, really brutal stuff. And all of this math factors into the American decision to drop the atomic weapon. So during the entire course of the war, the United States, as well as the Nazis and other countries, had been researching the possibility of using atomic or nuclear weapons. The American project and scientific research into this was codenamed the Manhattan Project, and was conducted mostly out west, kind of in an Arizona, New Mexico area. Our president, FDR, died. He was elected to his fourth term in office. You don't change a horse in the middle of a race. And he died shortly after winning this fourth term. And so his vice president, President Truman, is now in charge. And you have this Potsdam Declaration where we warn Japan, you have to surrender unconditionally or prepare for prompt and utter destruction. And when we receive no word from Japan, and he's looking at these numbers of this is what it's going to cost in lives to invade Japan, he authorizes the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The goal is to force these fanatical Japanese soldiers and this government that did not even discuss surrendering, they got to get them to surrender unconditionally. And there's a lot of controversy over the dropping of these. You'll notice we didn't drop atomic bombs on Tokyo, the capital, mostly because Tokyo had already been burned to nothing. We'll get into that later. We specifically chose 2 cities that had no real major military value. There was some weapon production there. There were some soldiers there, but they were not major military garrisons. And these cities had been deemed, quote unquote, by the Japanese, safe cities to send your kids to if you're afraid of them dying in one of the other major cities. and they were relatively untouched by bombing and by the war. And so, what we did by choosing these two cities is allow us to see what these weapons could do to untouched cities. And also, there's a lot of controversy. Did we not give enough time between the dropping of one bomb and the other for Japan to like figure out what happened? I mean, you drop one of these bombs, it destroys all of the communication lines. There's no phone call like, hey, they just dropped an atomic bomb on us. There's nothing like that. There's nothing. The city is flattened. Was adequate time given for the Japanese high command to realize what happened? So the atomic bombs. The first one is dropped on August 6, 1945, on the city of Hiroshima. An atomic bomb, specifically these are called fission bombs, Fission, because they create a chain reaction where atoms are split, and that essentially unleashes the power of the sun momentarily on Earth. In the initial blast, 80,000 are killed, and another 140,000 Japanese civilians die within 1 year, mostly due to radiation poisoning and radiation burns, which horrifically scarred and blinded pretty much anyone there. The city itself is destroyed. It's gone. The river itself was dried up. It instantly evaporated. The entire river. There was a city, and then there is no city. I mean, on the outskirts, you have some concrete buildings still standing, but for all intents and purposes, Hiroshima ceased to exist. 3 days later, we drop a second, slightly differently built bomb, also still an atomic nuclear bomb, on the city of Nagasaki. All right, 80,000 are killed instantly, another 80,000, 75,000 are injured, and another 80,000 are going to die over the next couple decades from radiation sickness, radiation poisoning, and incredibly rare and bizarre cancers from, well, the radiation. So were they necessary? They won the war. That was our decision that, we are going to do whatever it takes to win this war quickly. There were a lot of elements to this as well. The Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan and started invading Japanese colonies like in Korea. And we were afraid if the Soviet Union conquered all of these colonies, they would force them to be communist. That we didn't want that. That what if the Soviets invaded Japan rather than us? Like, oh, cool, we don't risk American lives. Yeah, but then Japan becomes a Soviet ally. Like, that's not super great either. And we're going to talk about the Cold War and stuff like that later. Why'd we drop two in such rapid succession? Did we want to show that to show the world and the Soviet Union specifically that we had more than one of these? That like, hey, bro, drop one. Okay, well, they have one. Do they have more? Yeah, we do. There's a lot of interesting elements and historiography exploring these concepts of why they were dropped. The document is a major turning point in history because this is him ending World War II for Japan. And since we'd already beaten the Nazis several months before, this is the end of World War II, which is dragged on. I mean, Japan had kind of been fighting this since, 1937, 31, if you want to count the invasion of Manchuria. And the emperor is forced by the treaty to renounce his divinity. There's some argument that the language he used in that speech was very archaic, older language, like hundreds of years old Japanese language, and that maybe he didn't really renounce his divinity. The U.S. Stardust occupies Japan as part of their peace treaty. It's an unconditional surrender. The actually only condition was that the emperor still got to be there. We marched our soldiers in, and we effectively took over Japan. Like, America ran Japan for several years, not quite a decade, but almost. And we oversaw the demilitarization of Japan. We forced the Japanese to accept a new constitution that we wrote for them. We're like, here's your new government, Japan, like forever. And if you ever don't obey this government, we're going to have some words. And by words, I mean bombs. Japan in this new constitution is prohibited from engaging in offensive war. This is still on the books, and this is very controversial in Japan. So Japan's army and navy and air force is super limited in size, and they are prohibited in their constitution from the ability to declare war or fight an offensive war. And in Japan today, and for the last couple decades, there has been a movement by Japanese nationalist parties to change the constitution, to allow them to build up their military again, and to allow them to potentially engage in war. Mostly, there's a lot of fear over the rise of China, and Japan's like right near China. That they generally don't sometimes get along that well. So definitely an interesting element that this constitution and the impact of this still has an effect on Japan today. However, many of the Japanese are like, no, we don't want to change the constitution. Like we learned our lesson. We were involved in a war before, and we got nuked. We're the only country that got nuked ever. We don't want more war. That didn't work out well for us. They, as part of this constitution, were forced to have a democratic Republican form of government with the Diet, their version of parliament, as a parliament. Women were given the right to vote, and according to their constitution, they have basic civil rights. Everyone does, like not just women, but everyone does. We basically created a Bill of Rights for them. It's different from ours, but it's similar. And, the right to press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all that stuff. And then we ended our occupation in 52. We were like, yep, job well done. We also did help rebuild Japan, not militarily, I apologize, industrially. We're like, yeah, sorry, we burned most of your cities to the ground. Here's money, and we're gonna rebuild your cities and put people to work rebuilding your cities. And that is effective because Japan becomes a major world power economically, and they still are to this day. We also kept air bases, so even though we left per se, we ended the occupation, we still have naval and air bases in Japan, like a massive naval base at Okinawa, air bases in several other cities, to counter the rise of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, to counter the Soviet Union. So let's look at the war and its impacts, ways that this war was significant. One of the significant elements, any war leads to massive growth in technology. I mean, war or the fear of war drives more technological innovation than almost anything in the world. I mean, capitalism drives a lot too, but you'll see even through a trickle down kind of effect, a lot of the technology that capitalism and innovation brings us has its roots in military technologies. So one of the new technologies is aircraft carriers. While battleships, like big giant cannons, 13-inch diameter cannons, they will be around. And I think the last time one was used is in the first Gulf War. We used a battleship coastal bombardment on Iraq. World War II really showed that aircraft carriers are now the main measure of naval power. That sure, one of these cannons can shoot a shell far, but aircraft fueled up can travel hundreds and hundreds of miles. And today, aircraft carriers are still the main measure of international power besides nuclear weapons. And America has 10 of these super aircraft carriers, more than all the other countries in the world combined. China has one functionally operational, and they're building 2 to 3 more. I believe they're building 2 more, the third in the initial stages of dry dock. And that's showing China wants to be a major world power today. Like them building and spending the money to build super aircraft carriers, that's a big deal. Radar and sonar are another invention to discover submarines, to try and stop the Nazi submarines, and to try to find out when the Nazi airplanes are coming, and to better able to counter the blitz, the attack for the Battle of Britain, and just to control basically the airspace. Well, these still have huge effects. Sonar is used to map the ocean floor, to locate sunken ships. Radar is used. It's the basis of our entire modern airports, right? Is finding out when planes are coming in, safely guiding them through the air so they don't crash into each other with hundreds of planes in the air at any moment. Paratroopers, which were a huge deal in World War II, don't really get used too much. I mean, there are paratroopers still today, but the ease of being able to shoot them out of the sky, they don't get used a lot. We just have them, and they're elite soldiers. First, computers. That's a big deal. So military codes and code breaking was like a huge deal in World War II. The Nazis had one of the most advanced coding systems in the world, known as the Enigma machine. And some of the first earliest types of computers created by a British scientist named Alan Turing were used to crack these codes. And knowing these codes, both the Japanese codes and the Nazi codes, gave us such a tremendous military advantage. It cannot be overstated that these code breakers and gentlemen like Alan Turing probably won us the war. And Alan Turing is an incredibly sad story. This guy's like the founder of modern computer systems, and he's a British, a British agent, member of like their government, and then eventually gets incorporated in like secret services and stuff like that. And he creates the first computers, creates these first code breakers, and then like as punishment, he for being a homosexual, he gets prescribed. The government's like, hey, like you can't be gay in Great Britain. Sorry, thanks for like winning the war for us, but like you can't. So like here's pills. You have to take these. These will make you resist your urges of being homosexual. And what they were was massive doses of female hormones. They were supposed to block his urges per se. And what they did is they put you in a huge depression, and he eventually committed suicide. So just really, this guy's a hero of the war, and his own government kills him. It's very depressing stuff. Obviously, atomic weapons were a huge deal. We'll be talking about those for the rest of the year, and long-range strategic bombers. The cost of these new technologies and lives is terrifying. All right, military and civilian deaths, you can see that the United Soviet Socialist Republic, the Soviet Union, loses nearly 20 million people. Just horrific. The Nazis were unreal, and the USSR was unreal. They just threw people into situations. Like, yeah, just charge the Nazis. Like, they'll eventually run out of bullets. Germany, fighting a two-front war and getting invaded from both sides, loses millions as well. China loses millions of soldiers, or a million soldiers, but their civilian deaths at the hands of Japanese occupation was unreal. Japan also loses, a large portion of their soldiers and quite a few civilians as well. But certainly the biggest losers per se are actually countries that quote unquote win the war: the USSR and China. United States, relatively small amount of civilians killed, mostly at Pearl Harbor. We did lose nearly 500,000 American soldiers fighting, more than Great Britain, more than France. So yeah, yay. But the war just cost millions upon millions of lives. So one of the elements that the Regents focus on aggressively in the social studies framework, and you see it a ton in multiple choice, and I think you'll be seeing them in CRQs as well, and definitely in enduring issues, is the idea of total war and the war crimes and horrors that come out of World War II. World War II exposed the violence that modernized and industrial nations could create. There's a great quote that, take all the science and industry and sheer production capacity and scientific knowledge and record keeping of the modern industrial period, and now turn it efficiently as possible to the action of killing others. That was World War II. And it was terrifying, as you can see from those casualty figures we looked at. And also, World War II was the idea of total war. It's not just my soldiers killing yours, it's the entire nation at war. And we had seen this a little bit during World War One. We'd seen rationing propaganda, but definitely it takes a different level. So these are some key terms that you would see in multiple choice and would be good to use in essays. Rationing. As part of total war, we need to conserve food, fuel, and resources to send them to the front. And we've got some great propaganda posters, American ones. You have a soldier on the front line, and he's wheeling barrels of oil to the front that are going to be used for planes and tanks and all that stuff. And you've got this old grandma back home, and she goes, I'm in this fight too. And she's lowering the thermostat and wrapping a shawl, a blanket around her to be warm. She goes, like, I'm going to use less oil. I'm not going to keep my houses warm. So that's oil that can go to the front line. And when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. And this is the idea that, like, if you're driving to work, find other people that go to the same work as you and drive with them. Carpool together. because if you're using gas to get your butt to work, that's gasoline that could go to American tanks and ships and et cetera, et cetera. You're helping Hitler. So rationing was a huge part of this war. I've seen many multiple choice using political cartoons or using other elements, and you have to know that that's rationing and that's part of total war. Propaganda was used on all sides to influence people at home, to keep the fight up, to keep soldiers up. And of course, a big one was bombing attacks. That not just are we going to bomb like a tank or an enemy fortress or base, we're going to attack cities. We're going to attack cities because that's where the factories are. We need to stop the factories from turning out war material. And we're going to bomb civilians because if civilians are unhappy, they might revolt. If civilians are dying, it makes their government look ineffective at protecting them. And that might lead to changes. That might lead to them demanding the war's end for their country. And if we're killing civilians, that'll lower the morale of the soldiers fighting on the front because they're all, soldiers like, I'm fighting on the front so my family doesn't die. Oh, wait, they bombed my home? My family's dead? Well, what's going on here? And other elements to look at. Before World War II, violence during the war was kind of considered an unintended side effect, right? War is hell. But a key change starts to happen as World War II progresses. After World War II, you're going to get new ideas about human rights. And they're created mostly as a reaction. These ideas develop mostly as a reaction to the war crimes and the war atrocities, to the total war and violence. These are actions carried out during the conduct of the war that violate accepted international rules of war. And it leads to the creation of a new idea, so ideas and beliefs, that there are things that are crimes against humanity. You can't just be like, well, yeah, sometimes you gotta shoot civilians in the head because they might backstab you. That's just war, bro. No, that's a crime against humanity. You can't just kill kids. You can't just starve people to death because you don't like them. That's a crime against humanity. And this is arguably a new idea that gets created, this new belief that there are things that are not acceptable in a time of war. You can't just be like, yeah, war's hell. Stuff happens. No. War doesn't have to be hell. You cannot make it purposely be hellish for civilians. So we're going to look at examples of these war crimes. Obviously, one of the most famous, or the most famous, possibly in the entire world, is, of course, the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a genocide. You need to know this word. It's a systematic and planned killing of a group or race of people. It has to be planned. That's the actual definition of genocide, that the government or groups of individuals plan preemptively to murder and kill off an entire group or race of people. The Holocaust specifically was targeted at a variety of peoples, but we generally use it to describe the genocide of the Jewish population of Europe. Jewish communities in Germany and then later on in the countries that the Nazis conquered, so France, Belgium, etc., were systematically rounded up and put into Jewish ghettos. One of the most famous was the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland or the Krakow Ghetto. And they were going to be watched there, and then slowly food would be cut off and supplies would be cut off and they'd be starved out. And then finally, that wasn't like getting rid of Jewish people fast enough for the Nazis. So they're going to start executions and concentration camps and the use of what were called Einsatzgruppen. So concentration camps. These are places where Jews, political prisoners, gypsies, known as the Romani people, homosexuals, the disabled, and Russians were sent and governed by the SS. They were camps where they used forced labor, starvation, medical experimentation, executions, and mass killings using gas chambers, using a new scientifically created gas called Zyklon B. And this was the Nazi final solution. The final solution, as they worded it, to the Jewish question. What do we do with the Jews of Europe? Their solution, kill them all. And that was the goal, the complete and utter destruction of Europe's Jews. And it was almost successful. Before World War II, there was roughly 9 million Jewish people living in Western Europe. And they killed 6 million of them. They killed 60%, 66% of Europe's Jewish population through the use of these. Einsatzgruppen are slightly different from concentration camps. Einsatzgruppen were used by the SS, the Schutzstaffel, that secret police slash terrifying military force of the Nazis. And they basically were like, they basically went into like jails of Nazi Germany and also other countries and like, hey, who here's like a murderer and a rapist? We're going to give you guns and we're going to give you a uniform and you're going to go round up Jews and kill them and just make their life horrible, just horrify them. And so they rounded up the worst people possible, gave them guns and uniforms, and turned them loose on Jewish populations. Really, really nightmarish and horrific. So certainly, obviously, this is a way where you could talk about the significance of the Nazis, the significance of the war, the significance of human rights violations. I mean, you can pull this in anything. This is clearly a human rights violation. Himmler is considered, and Heydrich were considered kind of some of the big minds that organized and carried out this final solution. The hard decision had to be made that this people, the Jews, should be caused to disappear from the earth. Perhaps at a much later time, we can consider whether we should say something more about this to the German people. Your average German person knew that the Jews were disappearing. They knew that the Jewish family that lived across the street wasn't there anymore. Did they know about the horrors of the camps? Your average German person might not have, but there were rumors, there was knowledge there that this was starting to happen, and it was brutal. Soviet war crimes. The Soviets also committed war crimes as well against several different peoples. Specifically, when they were still like high-fiving with Hitler and being like, yeah, we totally took over Poland. They rounded up thousands and thousands of Polish people, executed, imprisoned, and tortured these people during and after their invasion. One of the most famous of these was the forest of Katyn. They basically made these lists, these prescription lists, like they did during their purges when they had purges in the Soviet Union, of all people that they thought might be most likely to reject Soviet rule. And a lot of times it was like police officers, government officials, county clerks, judges, lawyers, etc. And they went door to door. They rounded these people up. They took them out to a woods in the middle of Katyn, and they just shot them all. Just killed all of them. They did the same thing to the Finns, killing thousands and thousands, even children, women, and the elderly. It did not matter. They executed German prisoners of war. Stalin famously gave the order, just as the Germans have raped the land of motherland Russia, so too shall we bring rape to the Germans. And so as the Soviet Union invaded Germany, this is known as the Rape of Berlin. 2 million, an estimated 2 million women and young girls were gang raped essentially by the Soviet government. So horrific was this that the German government basically allowed and provided for free birth control and abortions shortly after the war, because so many women had been forced to conceive children through this mass violence against women. So definitely some really brutal stuff going on the Soviet side. Japanese war crimes are arguably the most consistently, besides the Holocaust, seen on the regions, and this is really one of the big ones right here, the rape of Nanjing. So the Japanese Empire invades China in 37, right? They've already invaded Manchuria in 31, and now they're invading mainland China. And they're fighting both Chinese communists, and they're also fighting the Chinese nationalists under a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, which we're going to go into more detail in a couple units. And the nationalists weren't like super favorable on fighting against the Japanese. They frequently retreated. And so the Japanese target the capital of China, Nanjing, this massive city with millions of people living in this city. And the National Army basically kind of abandons the city. And the Japanese, there's no real soldiers left in the city. They essentially surround Nanjing, this Chinese city, and they close the doors and they kill most of the Chinese population. So it's known as the Rape of Nanjing or the Nanjing Massacre. The entire city was subjected to murder, mass executions, and mass rape. And it was part of the Japanese government strategy of the three alls: kill all Chinese, they are lesser Asians; loot all, steal anything not hammered down; and burn all left. And in a period of about 6 weeks, between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed. And obviously, this is a crime against humanity. It's a violation of human rights. And it's just brutal. The Japanese would use Chinese civilians for target practice, for bayonet practice. There was a game where two officers practiced how many people they could behead in one single strike. It was reported in Japanese newspapers like a baseball game, like Captain Nishihiro claimed 3 more heads today in a single stroke. Will Captain Hamamoto be able to keep up? It's just really brutal stuff, and really, these are all real photos. Last night, these are reports from Jonathan Rabe. He was actually a member of the Nazi parties, a Nazi consulate living in China. So he was like the Nazi consulate who dealt with China and who dealt with the Japanese. And he was an eyewitness to this massacre. And he tried to create safety zones welcoming the Chinese civilians. And he reported on like the horrors that the Japanese did to the Nazi high command. And the Nazis were like, yeah, bro, like we're kind of doing the same thing in parts of Europe, so we don't really care. And these are, just one of his many journals. Last night, up to 1,000 women and girls are said to have been raped. About 100 girls at Jinling College alone. You hear nothing but of rape. If husbands or brothers intervene and try to stop it, they're shot. What you hear and see on all sides is the brutality and bestiality of the Japanese soldiers. And yeah, that's a real picture of them just bayoneting a baby. Just horrific. So the rape of Nanjing, violation of human rights, targeting of civilians. Again, this city was basically mostly empty of Chinese soldiers. It was a city filled with a civilian population that were just mass raped and executed after in brutal, brutal fashion. Other Japanese war crimes, one of them is the Bataan Death March. Basically, thousands and thousands of U.S. and Filipino soldiers had been captured as prisoners of war. And you're not supposed to kill a prisoner of war. You're supposed to treat them well. You're supposed to feed them. There's all these rules to warfare. But what you can do is you can march them to another camp. And so the Japanese just kept these guys marching on and on and on with almost no food and water for 6 days. And thousands of them died. If you couldn't keep up, they just cut your head off or shot you. Generally cut your head off with those guntos, those fake samurai swords, because they didn't want to waste bullets on you. One of the most horrific examples of Japanese war crimes, and I would star it, is Unit 731. This was a special military research unit in the Japanese government that researched biological, germ, and chemical warfare. The idea here is to give the Japanese army an advantage against the Chinese, against whoever else they were going to fight. And they did a lot of medical experiments on people, testing out medical equipment, testing out military equipment, testing out poison gases. They practiced vivisection. So you might know what a dissection is. A dissection is when you take apart a dead thing to learn what killed it or to learn more about it. Vivisection is when you take something apart while it's still alive. And they became very good at this. They could keep people alive for like over an hour while they slowly cut open their chest cavity and remove their organs, weighing them and watching people as they died of this. They used and created more deadly forms of STDs, bubonic plague, and cholera. And they basically afflicted these deadly diseases on China, unleashing the bubonic plague, unleashing anthrax, unleashing diseases into Korea and into China. And they're responsible for at least almost 500,000 Chinese civilian deaths. There could have been many, many more. These are like just confirmed dead. So they're using biological weapons. They're using some of the most terrifying and deadly things to have ever affected mankind. They literally bred deadlier versions of the bubonic plague, went into villages and like passed out candies that were infected with them, or unleashed. They would unleash and drop off food supplies and be like, "Oh, we know your village hasn't had food in a long time because there's a war going on. Here's an aid package from the Red Cross." And the food would be essentially infected with fleas that had the bubonic plague, and then the entire village would just be wiped out. And they had been planning to use these plague bombs and plague weapons to attack America. There was a plan to basically a special Japanese long range submarine would have these plague rockets and would be able to unleash the bubonic plague onto California. The war ended before that plan activated. And the main guy responsible for it, Shiraishi, the lead researcher that was in charge of all of this stuff, we captured him, America did, and we gave him amnesty. We were like, "Yup, even though you are a literal human monster, we are going to let you get off scot-free. We're going to pay you a big juicy salary to live out the rest of your life, and we're going to give you a house as long as you give us all of your research data." He had burned like all the records, so only he knew a lot of what his research had found out about these deadlier diseases and how to transmit them. And we're like, "Yep, we want all of that research in biological warfare." We did the same thing with the Nazis. We're like, "Hey, you're a Nazi. That's terrible. Oh, you know how to make rockets? Cool. We want better rockets. We give you complete amnesty as long as you work for NASA and work for America." So this was a common thing. And the Soviets did it too. I mean, literally, America and the Soviet Union were in a race. They were hungry hippos snapping up research scientists from Germany because Germany had really good research scientists. Other Japanese war crimes, comfort women is a huge one. Basically, the Empire of Japan had legalized prostitution for the soldiers, but the Japanese women who were these military prostitutes didn't want to leave Japan. So as the Japanese Empire conquered other lands, Korea, China, Philippines, Vietnamese, they basically kidnapped young Asian women and they forced them into sex camps where they'd be mass assaulted by Japanese soldiers to keep the Japanese soldiers happy. They were either just straight up abducted, go into a village, round up all the girls between the ages of 13 and 30, or they were promised like work in a factory, like, "Hey, yeah, if you get on this train, like we're going to set you up with good work in a factory, you'll be able to provide for your family." And then the work was in these essentially sex camps. And Japan only acknowledged that this happened in 1993. And why this stuff is all important to acknowledge is looking at Japanese textbooks today. So the current prime minister, Shinzo Abe, who actually just resigned, he's part of a nationalist group in Japan. So he's in charge, but he's part of one of these groups that basically denies that any of these war crimes happened. And in Japan, they only have one series of nationally recognized textbooks. Like in America, like each school district can choose their own. Some states, like Texas, has a Texas accepted textbook. But in Japan, they have national textbooks. Like all Japanese kids learn from the same textbooks. And the Japanese ones that this government under Abe have accepted for decades now do not mention any of the war crimes that their government did and conducted. They don't acknowledge any of this. They don't call it the rape of Nanjing or the massacre of Nanjing. They call it the Battle of Nanjing. And it was a fair battle where both sides fought bravely and lost many men. Like, no. There weren't any soldiers in Nanjing. You killed them first and then desiccated the entire civilian population. And this is a denial of history, a whitewashing of history. And so this is still something we struggle with in America today, and every country, almost all of them struggle with, is what does a nation admit to? Does admitting to wrongs make people hate your own country, or does it allow you or engender in you as a people the ability to acknowledge when crimes have been committed and to seek atonement for them? So really, really interesting stuff there. Certainly something you can talk about this issue enduring or continuing to this day. This is one of the statues to the comfort women that exists. It is a young girl sitting across from the Japanese embassy, which is across the street here. And really, really interesting and somber monument to the horrors inflicted by the Japanese government. Well, what about Allied war crimes? There certainly were them. Again, as the war was a total war, it's a war waged without restraint. You know, you got to do what you got to do to win the war. One of the big tools used to punish our enemies and try to make this war end faster was the use of a new technology known as incendiary bombs or fire bombs. Some of you might be more familiar with this being called napalm. It wasn't napalm then, that's a later technology, but it's a similar thing. Some of the ways in which this was used, and that is considered by many today to be a war crime committed by the United States, is the firebombing of Dresden. Dresden was a German city. It had been deemed kind of a non-military German city. It had a garrison of soldiers, but they like wasn't major war production there. There wasn't a naval base there. They weren't pumping out tanks out of the city. It had been a city where a lot of Germans had sent their elderly and their children because like no one's gonna attack Dresden. There ain't nothing here. I mean, it's got all these beautiful monuments and churches and stuff, but it doesn't have any war industry. And we wanted to test out these new fire bombs on a city that was untouched. And so, over the course of a day, 800 Allied planes dropped high explosives and fire bombs, which created a firestorm where these massive burning torches sucked oxygen into the city, creating a literal wall and storm of fire that burned, well, most of the city. And between 35,000 and 135,000 were killed. And again, there weren't that many soldiers in the city. It was mostly women, children, and the elderly. Um, and you know, you have some anti-war propaganda period, not necessarily anti-American, just anti-war. That you can see the American star on the ship, and you know, a young woman carrying her burning and dead children through this fire. And once we found out those firebombs worked, we turned them on Japan. And so the firebombing of Tokyo and other major Japanese cities. Tokyo is the Japanese capital. The thought was, well, burn the city to the ground, and certainly the Japanese will surrender. And in the firebombing of Tokyo, there were about 330,000 civilians and soldiers killed, another almost 500,000 wounded. And Japanese built like most of their buildings out of paper and wood because they had lots of that, and only like government buildings and major factories were built out of stone or concrete. And so this just turned these entire cities into crispy critters, just as far as the eye can see, just torched bodies. This is literally one of the saddest movies I've ever watched. It's a very, very famous movie. It's a Japanese anime flick called Grave of the Fireflies. Yeah, you'll pretty much. I mean, if you can get through that with like completely dry eyes and you're actually seriously watching it, like good for you. You don't have a soul, and that's I'm sure that has a benefit somewhere. But you can definitely watch that flick if you want to learn more about the fire bombings and just it's just an interesting examination of the war from people that had no say in it. It's told from the perspective of a young teenage boy and his younger sister, and that's it. What did war mean to them, with no stake in it? Pretty horrific. Other Allied war crimes, one of them that definitely has been very controversial is the burning of Coventry. So this is a pretty wild one. Coventry is an English city, was a major city in Great Britain, home of beautiful cathedral, the Cathedral of Coventry, kind of a center of the Anglican Church in England. And the Allied powers and Winston Churchill, right, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, had learned from the Nazi Enigma code, from cracking this code, that this city was going to be bombed by the Nazis as part of one of their air raids, right? But if you then rush all of your planes to this city, which hadn't even been hit once yet, and you have anti-aircraft cannons, and you're ready. Well, the Nazis are going to know that their codes are compromised, and they're going to change them. That's one of the powerful things about the Enigma machine is you could really quickly change your code if it got compromised. And so Churchill has this decision: do I let this city get evacuated? Do I arm this city, or do I let it get bombed? And if I let it get bombed, we will continue to learn information from the Nazi codes because they're going to think their codes are still safe. And so he let the city get bombed. This is all that's left of the Cathedral of Coventry, just rubble and like the central arch. And he does this so the Nazi codes remain cracked and they can still learn from them. But certainly very controversial once records that this happened reached the press in Great Britain and other countries. And then, of course, some historians and some people in period have argued that the dropping of the atomic bombs was an Allied war crime. Why? Well, we're the only country to ever use nuclear weapons in anger. We are still the only countries that ever used nuclear weapons in anger. Was it necessary? Wasn't Japan already losing the war? Did we need to drop two? Did we need to drop them too close together? Did we give enough time for the Japanese to realize what had happened? And all of these questions, could we have dropped them on military targets versus dropping them on mostly civilian cities? All of these factor into some people looking at these as possibly Allied war crimes as well. So, in summary, World War II began due to a failed policy of appeasement. The League of Nations was unwilling and unable to control fascist governments from rising and from gaining power, leading eventually to the outbreak of World War I with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939. World War II ended up as a conflict between the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Japan, and Fascist Italy, and the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, and eventually the Soviet Union and the United States. World War II devastated populations, economies, nations, and, well, it devastated humanity. Horrible wartime atrocities were committed against ethnic groups, religious groups, and prisoners of war, as well as just, well, civilians. All bellicose nations, all warring nations, were involved in total war with new technology like firebombs and the atomic bomb, killing many people. World War II ended in the unconditional surrender of both Nazi Germany and Japan. And a big one, only the United States and the Soviet Union would remain strong, emerging from the war not just as world powers, but as what we're going to call world superpowers after the war. Thanks for joining us, and I will catch you in our next set of notes.